Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first afternoon session, and chair is Jirka Horák.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to the afternoon session. And today we will have some talks about mostly numerical simulations of accretion flows. And we have four interesting lectures, and the first one is by David Abarca from Warsaw, and he will talk about beamed emission in accretion simulations of neutron stars, ULX. So David, please.
Okay. Okay, here we go. So, yep, I'm David Abarca from TOMPK in Warsaw. So I'm going to talk about ULXs, specifically pulsating ULXs. So ULX, what it is basically a very bright extragalactic X-ray source. They're usually something around 10 to the 40 ergs, maybe 10 to the 39, 10 to the 41. Really quite bright, and they're not associated with galactic centers, so they're just in the outer parts of galaxies. In 2014, one of these ULXs was discovered with pulsations, specifically 1 second coherent pulsations. And what that implied was that the central object should be a neutron star. And since then, there's been something like 10 of these pulsating ULXs found. So if you calculate the Eddington luminosity for one solar mass neutron star, you would find that you would have to be emitting at 100 times the Eddington rate to get up to these really bright 10 to the 40 erg luminosities. So we now know that probably a lot of ULXs, even not just the pulsing ones, are with neutron stars. So the idea is to simulate these systems and see how they work, basically. Okay, so there has been some debate over the magnetic field strength, because as we all know, neutron stars can have very strong magnetic fields. So there's two camps. One supports the higher magnetic field, and the explanation for this would be you have a high magnetic field, and that lowers the electron scattering cross-section in the direction perpendicular to the magnetic field. So this lets more light out. And also there was an observation of a cyclotron line in a non-pulsing ULX. And if you assume that the cyclotron line was due to protons, you would get something like a 10 to the 15 Gauss field. However, if you take the same line and you interpret it as being produced by electrons, you would get something like 10 to the 11 Gauss. And additionally, there was another cyclotron line that was attributed to electrons, giving you a 10 to the 12 Gauss in another ULX. And lastly, there's the idea that ULXs have been associated with very strong outflows. And if your magnetic field is too large, what you're going to do is you're going to cut off the accretion flow out farther than the spherization radius. And the spherization radius is where the outflows start to begin for super Eddington flows. So another interesting thing is the really high spin-ups observed in pulsating ULXs. And so there was a model introduced that tried to explain this whole spin-up interaction with the magnetic field, the spherization radius, and everything. And so this model was producing magnetic field strengths of something like 10 to 11, 10 to the 13. And another consequence of this model was that the emission should be highly beamed. And this is actually what would be producing these super high luminosities that have been observed. So it's not just that there's 100 Eddington luminosity being emitted from the source. It's all beamed, right down the center at you. So these beaming factors, which is defined as the total luminosity to the observed luminosity, is something like 0.01 to 0.6. And so here's all the different beaming factors from King and Lesota 2020. So we want to see what kind of beaming factors we can get from our simulations. So the simulations are general relativistic radiation magnetohydrodynamics. And this is the equations of motion. So basically we're solving conservation of mass, conservation of energy momentum, conservation of radiation momentum, energy, momentum, and Maxwell's equations. This is the general relativistic form of the equations, but if you decompose them, they basically all look the same. They look like conservation laws. So you have the rate of change of some quantity is equal to minus the divergence of the flux of that quantity, plus you have some source term. Okay. Now, when you want to do this in the form of simulations, you have to discretize space. Okay, so we divide space up into a numerical grid, and then we're just solving the equations of motion in each one of these little grids. So you can pick a quantity, it can be momentum, mass, and something, and you use information in the surrounding cells to figure out what the flux of that quantity is through the cell walls, and then it's just a finite difference to evolve in time. So quite straightforward once you get the hang of it. Some details of the specific code I'm using. So I'm using Coral. This was developed by Sadowski, and the code evolves radiation using the M1 closure scheme, which basically says that we evolve radiation as a fluid, and we assume that there is some frame of reference where the radiation tensor looks isotropic. So if you can imagine, if radiation is streaming in one direction, we can move along with the radiation, and in our frame, it looks isotropic. Then you transform back to the lab frame, and you can keep doing physics. This allows radiation to stream on geodesics through optically thin regions and diffuse through the gas in optically thick environments. And so this leads to total conservation of energy and momentum when you include radiation. We do our simulations in 2D axisymmetry, and this normally is a problem because the magnetic field decays in 2D when you have MRI, but we sustain the field with a sort of artificial dynamo that works quite well to mimic the 3D effects. And we use the ideal MHD approximation. So we assume in the frame of the fluid, the electric fields are zero, and we can ignore them. So some details. This is the stress energy tensor of gas and the magnetic field. So the thing about magnetized stars is that if you have a dipole field, here we have the magnetic field energy density, which is just the magnitude of the magnetic field 4 vector. This scales to something like r to the -6. Okay, so that's a very strong gradient, makes it very hard to deal with numerically. The other problem is that during the simulations, we're constantly going back and forth between the conserved quantities and the primitives. So calculating T mu nu is easy if you know these things. But if you want to calculate the rest of it knowing T mu nu, that's very hard. And this will give you a lot of crazy numerical errors when you have a large B squared. So these guys, Parfait and Shkosky, came up with a good method to sort of get around these problems. And so I started collaborating with Carl Parfait, and I implemented his sort of force-free inspired fluorine scheme into Coral. There is another simulation actually out there of accretion onto a magnetized neutron star, but I can't tell you how they managed to do it. Okay, so just to see this issue with how strong the magnetic field is. So there's a quantity that tells us basically how the energy is dominated between either the magnetic field or the rest mass energy density. So this is the magnetization. And you can see that if we look at the log of magnetization in the magnetosphere, in this magnetically dominated polar region, it gets to be very high, like 10 to the 4. And normal GRMHD starts to break down when sigma is around 1, maybe up to 10, 15, something like this. So you can see how important it is that we have something to take care of this issue. Okay, so the way I set up the simulations is in a very standard way for these accretion disk simulations. We start with an equilibrium torus, which is threaded by a weak magnetic field. And keep in mind that the actual domain goes out to like 1,000 gravitational radii. I'm just showing you the inner edge. This torus should feed gas at something like 20 of these Eddington M dots, which is basically 300 Eddington luminosities over c squared. I have a dipolar magnetic field, and we chose 2 × 10 to the 10 Gauss for our initial field strength. I ran pretty reasonable resolutions. This is about 500 by 500 cells, and I run them for about 4,000 gravitational times. Okay, So one of the focuses of this study, besides just the beaming, was actually testing different boundary conditions. So there's sort of 3 different boundary conditions that we considered, okay? And basically, the idea is that gas is falling in these accretion columns onto the star, and it hits the star, and then a radiation shock is developed. So the gas slows down and it sinks through the radiation field. Meanwhile, photons are streaming out the side. So that's sort of the classical picture. So the question is, how can we recreate this inner boundary? So one example is just to say, let's cut off the simulation here. Okay, let's assume that everything that goes in just falls into the star and we won't worry about it. So this is the absorbing boundary condition. And this has been used in the past for some accretion simulations. Another is to say, well, let's try to say that our neutron star is just a perfectly reflecting sphere. So we can stick the inner boundary here, and we can reflect gas and radiation, and that way nothing actually gets onto the star at all. The last is to say, okay, let's say that there are some radiative processes that we can't really account for that happen when the gas hits the surface of the star. And maybe this produces more radiation than we can produce from the code itself. Or maybe there's some energy that's being pumped into the star that doesn't actually get returned to the simulation. So the third boundary condition is sort of an energy reflective boundary where we measure the inflowing flux of radiation and gas energy, and we return that as a outflowing we return that energy as radiation flowing out of the star, scaled by some albedo, because we can account for different amounts of the energy being absorbed by the star. So here are just some average, some time averages. So on the right, I'm showing gas density. On the left, I'm showing radiation energy density. So this is for the absorbing. You can see that there's some radiation that's escaping out the poles. If you start to, this is the energy reflection. So if you start to turn up the albedo, you get a little bit more radiation, although it's hard to see. If you turn up the albedo even higher, you have 3/4 of the energy is being returned, and you actually start to get the beginning of a radiation shock. And I think this is the most interesting simulation that we run. So I'm going to stop here and show a movie. Okay, so this is the albedo 0.75. The gas falls onto the star, and you can see that we get these radiation shocks that are sustained for like a couple hundred gravitational times. So the gas comes in, it flows along the column, it hits the surface. Most of the gas falls through, but it has to slow down and sink through the radiation field. You can also see that there's some outflows. This is a mix of radiation and magnetically driven outflows. And it just continues on like this quite smoothly. You can see all of the radiation streaming along the poles. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, return to the slides. Okay. So that was albedo 0.75. And then the pure reflecting. Now what happens when the pure reflecting is all of the gas can't go anywhere, so it just sort of piles up on the inner edge. And there's so much radiation that fills up this magnetosphere that it starts releasing some radiation bubbles. And that's why the magnetic field looks so warped here. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning that these sources are associated with strong outflows. So that's one of the things we want to measure. So what I'm plotting here is basically the momentum in the poloidal plane. So I take rho times the radial velocity and multiply it by 2 pi r sine theta, basically. I think I'm missing an r here. So this is basically the momentum in the poloidal plane. So we can see that blue, which is pointing out, there's a pretty reasonable outflow, okay? And this is something we would expect from a supercritical disk. And you can even see that the outflow kind of starts beyond the Alphen surface, or beyond the radius of the magnetosphere. So it's really the disk that's responsible for driving these outflows. And we need these outflows to happen because if for example, the magnetosphere truncated the disk out here, we wouldn't get a lot of these outflows, and then we wouldn't have anything to collimate the accretion, the radiation flow. So I said here that this is somewhat weak outflow, and that's because if you compare it to the reflecting simulation, you can see that it's way stronger and even more collimated. So the radiation we would expect to be even more highly beamed here. So this is going to be interesting to see that, you know, what boundary condition gives us the highest beaming. And basically, there's such a strong outflow because there's nowhere for the gas to go, so it has to flow out, and there's nowhere for the radiation to flow, so the radiation is providing this extra force to sort of push all of the gas out. Okay. So probably the most important thing to get from these simulations is the radiative output, because we want to sort of reproduce what's been observed in ULXs. So I have two plots here. On the left is the isotropic observed luminosity. So this is if you sit at some radius and measure the flux from the source and multiply that by the surface area of a sphere at that radius, this is the luminosity you're going to get. So if you're perfectly isotropic, it's going to, you know, that's how you measure the luminosity. But if you're not isotropic, you're going to overestimate the luminosity. And that's what's happening here. We can see that for the lowest albedo runs, or for the absorbing run, we have something like 150 L Eddington. And if we go up to the, you know, the highly reflective high albedo runs, it can get all the way up to 500. So extremely strong. Now we compare that to the total luminosity. And so what I'm doing is measuring the total outflowing radiation through optically thin regions of space. So this is only the radiation that's expected to reach the observer. Same thing here. This is the radiation that's expected to reach the observer. This is the radiation that's trapped, you know, trapped by the gas. So we can see that the total luminosity is only between like 5 and 15 Eddington. So to calculate the beaming, we just have to divide these two things. Okay, so that's what I've done here. And this is measured at radius 450, and we can see that our beaming factor is 1/20 to 1/30. And if you can do mental math, you can see that that pretty much lies right in the range, probably the lower end of the range that was shown by these King and Lesotho models, which is encouraging. But this was measured at radius 450, and the observer sits at infinity. So the question is, what's going to be the beamed, how beamed are these things going to be once you really sit back far away from them? So we can get an idea from this. This is not my work. This was borrowed from the group at CFA. And so they developed the code HEROIC, which is a radiative post-processing, which basically takes the simulation data and then recalculates the radiation to see, you know, what the spectra is and what the proper radiation field is. Because in M1, this scheme that evolves the fluid, the scheme that evolves the radiation for Koral, you can actually have interaction between the radiation, okay? Because, you know, you can only give it sort of one preferred direction, and you can't allow radiation to cross each other. So you might wonder, maybe this beaming is just an effect of M1. So this green line here, basically it's the same thing I'm showing here, but it's only up to pi/2. So it's only the left half of these plots. So the green line is something that you would see from Koral, and the blue line is if you do these radiation post-processing. So this is actually encouraging and telling you that, okay, at least for a black hole, because this was a black hole simulation, you're reproducing the radiation field pretty well. But again, this was measured something close to the simulation. So the good thing about this HEROIC field, this HEROIC code, is it can extrapolate that radiation field, and you can calculate what the observer at infinity is going to see. So if you redo the post-processing, except now you're sitting at infinity, what you get are these red dots, okay? So we can see that as the radiation escapes, it spreads out a little bit, but not all the, it doesn't come perfectly isotropic. So probably we lose something like half an order of magnitude in the peak brightness. So this will raise the beaming by a factor of 3, 4, maybe, assuming everything carries over to the neutron star case, which is still, right where we want it to be. which is good. Now, the last thing to wonder about is what's actually doing the beaming. So I mentioned that in the models, it's all about the outflows. These supercritical disks launch outflows, which collimate the radiation. But we have another source of something else to collimate the radiation. We have the magnetic field, which channels the accretion into these accretion columns. And when you look in 3D, it's going to look like a funnel. So you would expect the radiation to only be able to escape vertically. So we can measure this beaming really close, like right in the middle of the accretion columns, and you can see that it goes up significantly. But we saw that when you measure it at larger radii, it drops down, and then it's only collimated by the outflow. So it's interesting to see, and it would be good to do the post processing on the whole simulation to see, which one of these beamings is more dominant. But the good news is that regardless, we still are matching with the theoretical models that have been produced. So in conclusion, we see these very bright, we reproduce these very bright apparent luminosities. The beaming is consistent with the lower magnetic field models. And we have something interesting to study further about, what's actually doing this beaming. So that's everything I have. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice talk. We have still a lot of time for questions. So if somebody is interested in something, please, this is the time.
May I have a question?
Yes, sure.
Just for my clarification, in your beaming plots, the previous two slides, I'm not sure if I understand what is theta equals 0 and pi.
Yes, this is theta. Sorry, my units are funny. This is theta over pi, so this would be from 0 to pi.
Yeah, but 0 is which direction? Actually? And
up, I suppose. Okay, here. I didn't explain this well, and I realized that I am measuring the beaming as a function of the observation angle. So as you look from different angles, how much radiation are you going to see? So if you look at theta equals 0, that's the equivalent of looking down the pole. If you look at theta equals pi, that's the equivalent of looking along the pole, but the southern pole and looking straight up. So these 0 and pi is what the radiation looks like here, and around pi over 2 is what the radiation field looks like here when the disk, this is the plane of the disk, and here's the poles.
But why is it not symmetric about 0 and pi?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. It's I tried to measure the asymmetry as a function of time, and it actually bounces back and forth. Sometimes you have more radiation in the northern hemisphere, sometimes you have more in the southern hemisphere. So I think it's just a statistical effect, a long-term oscillation in sometimes there's more gas that wants to go above, sometimes there's more gas that wants to go below. It doesn't seem to be correlated to anything. It doesn't seem to be periodic. It just sort of changes and goes up and down.
I see. Thank you. It's interesting.
Okay, thank you. Another question by Anna.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I want to ask the nature of this radiation. Is it thermal or is it non-thermal?
So it's thermal radiation. We have mainly everything is electron scattering and Comptonization. There's also Bremsstrahlung absorption, but the temperatures are so high that the absorption opacity is very small. So it's basically just scattering.
And the magnetic field, how strong it is?
2 times 10 to the 10 Gauss at the surface.
So with these values, probably you can have also like a synchrotron proton, right? Like
probably.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So if there are no more questions, thank you, David, very much again.
Thank you, everyone.
And